Imagine, a podcast series by Imagine Theatre.
Hello again, how are you? I'm Martin Ballard, and I'd like to welcome you to episode 47 of the Just Imagine podcast, and the first of an occasional series looking at the most popular pantomime titles.
For more information, go to their website at www.imaginetheatre.co.uk.
Well, thanks first of all for downloading this episode. Don't worry if you've missed any of the previous ones, because you can still listen to them. We've had some fabulous guests so far, from members of the Imagine Theatre headquarters team in Coventry to performers and backstage teams at the various venues for Imagine shows across the UK. We've talked about how pantomime is produced, its history, and of course its future. And don't worry, because there are many more episodes to come from one of the UK's biggest producers of pantomime and children's theatre, so make sure you subscribe. In the last episode, I spoke to the man with 40 years in the industry as either Dame or Ugly Sister, Nigel Ellicott. This time, I've been joined by Imagine's Managing Director, Steve Boden, and Artistic Director, Eric Potts, for the first of an occasional series looking at the most popular pantomime titles. And what better show is there to start with than Cinderella? So, Steve and Eric, thank you so much for talking to me, first of all.
You're welcome.
Nice to be with you, Martin.
You've both been involved with Cinderella hundreds of times. Steve, as a producer, it is undoubtedly the most popular title, isn't it? Why is that? Is it the story?
The story, I think, is iconic. When you talk to audience members and you talk to performers and you talk to people in the industry and people who aren't necessarily involved in the industry, their favourite pantomime, almost always Cinderella comes out top. And I think it's probably because it's been around for so long, and it's probably one of the first pantos that we all saw when we were growing up. It is a rags to riches tale, and everybody loves a story about an underdog. And I think Cinderella is the perfect underdog story where success follows, a fairly gentle and sometimes difficult existence.
The story obviously has its roots as a fairy tale, Eric, and it is a magical story. It has all the elements that pantomime needs, doesn't it?
Very much so. I mean, it's had so many variations over the years. It's been a ballet, it's been an opera, it's been a stage musical written by Rodgers and Hammerstein, filmed versions. And of course, I think we mustn't forget, with its current popularity within the pantomime portfolio, it has its Disney version, which I think influences a lot of people. It's such a well-known tale. As Steve said, it's the underdog winning through in the rags to riches story. But I think audiences know that it's going to be magical. It's going to be spectacular because of the magic involved in the traditional fairy tale version. Luckily, we don't focus as much on the Grimm brothers tale, which involved the ugly sisters cutting their toes off to fit into the crystal slipper. We tend not to do that in all our productions now. So it's more magical rather than grotesque.
And to prove the point of why it is so successful and why it's lasted so long, because we've lost so many other titles over the decades, over the centuries, but it remains the most popular because it's a timeless tale. And the recent Andrew Lloyd Webber musical version or adaptation proves the point, doesn't it, Steve?
Yes, I think the title Cinderella is a very strong title. Wherever you have the title of a show, be it a musical, a play, a comedy, a pantomime, about the central character, it's very easy to identify with that and what that is going to be. And as we've just been talking about, the generations of storytelling about this tale continually evolves. And I think that just gives a demonstration as to how powerful the story is. For pantomime, of course, it provides great opportunity for elaborate staging, comedy, drama. All the elements that you want in a good story can be easily reflected in the tale of Cinderella.
Let's talk about the stock characters, because it is slightly different to all other pantos, Eric, isn't it? Because of the wicked stepmother or the baron, and then the two sisters. So the dynamics are slightly different, aren't they?
They are, in that we don't have such clear-cut good and bad influences as we have with Fairy and King Rat and Dick Whittington, etc. The ugly sisters, or the wicked stepsisters, as they're sometimes known, are tricky roles to play because they are, in essence, both the jeopardy and the comedy, from the grotesque, I suppose its roots in commedia dell'arte, the males playing the ugly sisters. They are grotesque, they are horrible, they are truly nasty to Cinderella, but at the same time, certainly within the structure of modern pantomimes, we rely on them to provide a lot of the comedy, which is why we focus quite a lot on the wicked stepmother, the ugly sister's mother, who has married Cinderella's poor father, Baron Hardup. So there's a sort of strange balance of threat, of jeopardy, because we're also relying on them for the laughs. But it does work, and as long as we create enough hatred, enough venom from the 2 or 3 wicked characters to create the pathos that we need from Cinders and her best friend Buttons, then that balance is maintained as it is in other pantomimes.
The challenge for the ugly sisters, traditionally played by men, of course, Steve, is that the dynamics in terms of the audience interaction is different. Very often, you'll have the comic, of course, you'll have the dame who, have fun with the audience, and then you'll have the baddie who draws the boos. The ugly sisters get a bit of both, don't they?
They have a degree of anarchy, but as Eric was saying, they are there to provide threat and jeopardy. So it is a fine balance. I think the audience, when it works perfectly, the audience love to hate the sisters. And I think some of the antics that they get up to helps shape that relationship that we have with them. And of course, it's interesting, and I'm sure people are aware of the changes in trends in Cinderella. We've started to see an introduction of female actors playing the sisters, as Eric mentioned, in a sort of wicked sister way, more slightly streetwise and obnoxious, with a slightly different dynamic. So it's really interesting to see how the exploration of those two characters is evolving. In decades gone by, there were pairings of actors who just did sisters each Christmas. Nigel and Peter, as you mentioned, they just did a fantastic routine of sisters that would appear in different theatres across the country each year, and there were various other partnerships that would do that. Sadly, those sort of comedy pairings, strong relationships, are becoming less and less, and also the way we portray those characters is evolving, as Panto always does. So yeah, the role of sisters, I think, is a fascinating journey that we're on.
And it is a difficult one, isn't it, Eric? Because as Steve said, Nigel and Peter would go from venue to venue each year working together. Now that doesn't happen so much, and so you're very often putting maybe 2 dames together for a short rehearsal period to actually create a double act, because that's what it is, really, isn't it?
It really has to be a really close-knit double act. We see them working so easily together. And yeah, one of the most famous sort of pairings of Ugly Sisters, going back a bit, was John Inman and Barry Howard. And as Steve said, they would play sisters each Christmas and then go off and do Summer Season or wherever as a double act. So it is getting that magic, that shorthand between the 2 performers is vital, and it is proving more difficult when we have to cast either 2 actors who have regularly played Dame separately and put them together for Ugly Sisters, or there are a few pairings that still do the rounds, but they are getting more few and far between, sadly.
Let's talk about some of the unique elements. Of course, Panto does need certain things. Traditionally, we talked about that interaction with the audience, a transformation scene, for instance, maybe some slosh, the song sheet, and so on. But there are some unique elements to Cinderella, aren't there? Let's talk about the transformation first of all, because I think for many people that is the most magical of all, isn't it, Steve, in Cinderella?
It really is. From a creative point of view, when we sit down and we work out what are the key points of the story and in the arc of the story of Cinderella, what are the moments that we and the audience want to explore, the transformation scene is without a doubt probably the most iconic of all pantomimes. And it's been done in multiple ways over the years, and there are so many ways that you can portray that. The traditional way, of course, is turning a pumpkin into a carriage and turn mice into horses and lizards into coachmen and footmen. But how you actually realize that can be done in a multitude of ways. Classic versions where it happens in front of your eyes in a magical way, potentially using a bit of UV, ultraviolet lighting, or indeed projection, as we've done, and a combination, I think, of physical objects, spectacular illusion, great costume changes, so that it layers up and you're constantly surprised in the audience. I think that's probably the most satisfying way of doing it.
This is, Steve, an area that you've invested in a major way over the last decade or so. And it's similar in a way to the way that theme parks have gone in terms of using projection and audio animatronics and so on. Traditionally, we may have seen Shetland ponies on stage, which can bring their own problems, I have to say. You might need a bucket and a spade afterwards. But then you invested in audio animatronics, which was a real wow for the audience, wasn't it?
It really was. I remember we went to see a production at Derby Playhouse, and Alan Jackson was a fantastic ex-Rolls-Royce engineer who had retired early from Rolls-Royce and was working with Derby Playhouse to just follow his passion for theatre. And they were doing a production of Cinderella, and very keen to work with him on a new effect for the transformation scene. And we had a great close relationship with Derby Playhouse at that time, where we would look at being able to take the sets from them and reuse them, recycle them, use them again. And the opportunity to develop the carriage with Alan was probably the most pivotal moment of the company, because here was an opportunity to do something spectacular that didn't involve bringing live animals onto stage, and the problems, and actually the kind of acceptance of whether actually that is, what we should be doing in this day and age. And Alan's incredible knowledge of hydraulics, motors, gearing, and how that could be turned into a theatrical prop, and with the technology to build something as unique as that, was really groundbreaking at the time. This was early 2000s. So that effect was probably the thing that was talked about most about that production, and indeed a lot of productions that season. So we then commissioned Alan to make a second one, and then a third, and then other producers commissioned a few as well. And suddenly I think Alan was kind of running a production line of Pegasus flying horses and carriages. And still to this day, they're a very successful and spectacular effect for the end of the act.
That's the key word, Eric, isn't it? Because every panto has to have perhaps a spectacular element. One of the things that people leaving the auditorium will talk about after the show. And there's no doubt when you see the coach and horses in Cinderella first start to flap their wings and then start to move up and then to turn towards the audience, it keeps lifting the level of awe in the audience, Eric, doesn't it?
Oh, it builds beautifully. It is an absolutely spectacular moment. And I'm reminded, it looks stunning wherever the Pegasus ends up flying to. But we have a wonderful venue north of the border at the Palace Theatre in Kilmarnock, which is not a big venue. It's just under 500. And the stage isn't huge. But I directed the production of our Cinderella there a few years ago and was determined, along with Steve and the Imagine team and the team at the venue, we were going to find a way of getting one of our wonderful flying horses into the venue. And this actually involved the deconstruction of a condemned lift which had been at the back of the building. So this was a major sort of undertaking. But as you say, just the wow factor when that Pegasus appeared at the back of the stage, started moving its wings, moving its neck and head, flew forward with the carriage behind carrying Cinderella. They'd never seen anything like it. And that is pantomime. That's what it's about. Just all those young faces. We hope with that one moment, as well as the surrounding 2 hours of entertainment, is something that will make them want to come back into these buildings again. We are creating the theatre-going generation to come.
Traditionally, a fabulous end to the first act, which gives everybody 15, 20 minutes to go away and talk about how fantastic it is. And be excited to come back in for the second half. There are other elements, of course. You may find a balloon ballet, for instance. The song sheet is there and all the other elements that we've talked about. But the slosh scene, Eric, is slightly different in Cinderella, isn't it? Because, of course, we're not talking about a matronly, motherly dame figure here baking a cake or doing similar. And so generally, traditionally, the slosh or whatever you want to call it, can be a scene with the two sisters doing their makeup and so on.
Yes, this is it. The old beauty cream gets put to very good use in a version that we've been using recently. There are many ways of doing it, but again, it's the undermining of the grotesqueness of the ugly sisters, and that they think they're even remotely capable of making themselves beautiful for the ball. So we start throwing the beauty cream around between the sisters and Buttons, who normally ends up getting quite a good proportion of it, so that the actors rather playing the characters of the sisters don't have to totally redo their makeup, which is a major issue as well. But yeah, we can have a really good sloppy, sloshy scene using the beautifying of the non-beautiful, ugly sisters.
We'll talk in more detail in a moment's time about the script with Eric, and there are other things to consider: music, the casting, set, props, costumes, and so on. Are there any particular demands that are unique for this particular show in terms of cast size or anything?
Yes, there are. I think when you look at the production of Cinderella, it's one of the few pantomimes that features a kind of a two principal boy lineup of both a prince and a manservant Dandini. And that's unusual. I mean, when you think back to most other pantomime titles, and particularly when the principal boys were played by female performers, you would have to budget for wardrobe provision of two regal costumes as day wear for the prince and for Dandini, and obviously the two sisters, so two dame sets of costumes. So whenever you do a production of Cinderella, you're aware that there are also going to be additional demands on a production budget, and that's that's one of the peculiarities of this title. So your wardrobe requirements are always greater on Cinderella. But I think what's interesting is, there's a lovely set of dynamics, and it's worth the investment, because having two principal boys, whether they're played by male or female performers, and the two sisters, produces an extra level of spectacle and energy in the show. And of course, other budget considerations in Cinderella is the transformation scene that we've discussed, and the costuming of a ball scene, and also a walk down finale. It's one of the biggest wardrobe requirements of any pantomime.
And Steve, we talked about the transformation. One thing that a lot of people may not think about, particularly if they don't work in the industry, is that Coach and Horses, it looks amazing on the stage, and it may only just fit on the stage, but it's still fantastic. What they don't consider is where you put it when it's not on stage, and how you get it on and off the stage easily, because it can be a challenge in itself.
It's a huge set piece, and as Eric alluded to, certain venues require a bit more kind of out of the box thinking as to how it can be accommodated. What I love about pantomime and working with the venues across the country, and I'm sure all producers feel the same, is it becomes a real partnership, and there is as much excitement in the venue and the stage crew at the opportunity to be able to accommodate these sort of effects, that they are all bought into it, and we frequently have conversations as to how we can work a show with these large set pieces. You've also inevitably got a ballroom staircase that's a large set piece, the carriages, all the various bits that go with the coach and horses. So yes, there is often a game of Tetris going on in the wings during the interval as everything's moved around, and also trying to work out how to get the piece of kit in the building in the first place, which often involves dismantling certain pieces of the infrastructure of the building to accommodate. But that's what panto is. It is big, it is large, it's high impact.
In terms of the script and the music, Eric, all the elements we've talked about are there. So people may think, well, it's easy then, isn't it? Because you know what you're going to have, you know who the characters are, you know when the transformation scene is, and so on. But it's always a challenge, because we've talked about the evolution of pantomime, how it has to keep moving on. It has to be fresh. Although people want the same story, they don't want the same gags, they don't want the same stuff every year. So what's the challenge in writing a script each year?
Well, exactly. The story of Cinderella will always be the story of Cinderella. And I believe it shouldn't be tampered with. I've seen pantomimes where people have tried to be clever, change things, and audiences go out going, no, oh, that's a shame. They didn't have that bit or whatever. Audiences with panto, they know what they're getting. I believe parents and grandparents bring their children to panto to see and enjoy the show as much as they did 25 years earlier, 50 years earlier. So, yes, you have your template story. Obviously, with Imagine and other producers, we are dealing with productions from Inverness to Hastings. So it has to be written regionally to fit in with the local audiences. So north of the border, that involves dialect. We have 3 productions over in Wales. So we incorporate a little bit of Welsh speaking. We incorporate words that those audiences will recognise, that will feel familiar and almost comforting to them, that they know the panto has been written for them. We then, in some of our productions, have star casting where we have someone off the telly. So we have to acknowledge their presence on stage. So you write for your cast. And then obviously Panto is, as it always has been from his first sort of proper recognisable variation that we know back in Theatre Royal during Victorian times, it is a piece of contemporary theatre. So we have to update the script. And as you know yourself, during rehearsals, if anything particularly significant happens in the world round about us that we can use and incorporate in the script to get an extra laugh, be it something from politics, something from the television, an advert, a commercial, always surprises me how popular strap lines from commercials, like "you should have gone to Specsavers" or something like that, are with audiences when they're dropped into a panto script. So it is always changing, as it should do. It's always evolving, and that goes with music choices as well. We like to use recognizable music hits, if you like, from various genres, pop or sort of jazz and all those sort of different fields of music. Some producers like to write their own numbers, but we like the audiences to join in, sing along. So again, the music choices will change year on year, so that basically you have a fresh product that is accessible, it is recognizable, and it's specifically written for the audiences that are going to watch it, be they in Glenrothes or Swindon.
It's interesting what you say about topicality as well, because I think Brexit, COVID to a certain extent, have all appeared in scripts, jokes about things like that, always topical and popular. I remember doing pantomime the very first year that the National Lottery was launched. And would you believe we even gave the winning lottery numbers for those people who obviously weren't at home to see it on BBC One? In terms of the music as well, you have to reflect the casting, and that's something that, let's say this year, Eric, you've got Justin Bieber appearing in Scotland somewhere. You'd have to put some Justin Bieber songs in, wouldn't you?
But exactly, this is it. We pick up on what is happening round about us in our Scottish productions. We always manage to try and get in maybe one Proclaimers number or one Bay City Rollers for our older listeners, something that is really going to be recognisable for our Scottish audiences. But as you say, with the Bieber situation this year, we're going to have a look at that. Last year, with the release of the Elvis film, we put into the shows a big Elvis kind of multi-mix at the end, got people on their feet dancing, and they absolutely loved it. So it's all about topicality, both script-wise and musical.
This is the most popular pantomime title, therefore that will be reflected at the box office, and therefore you probably don't need to worry about marketing quite so much, do you?
That's a really interesting conversation. Pantomime always has popular titles. Cinderella is certainly right up there, but it's interesting how potentially companies like Disney reissue films, movies, update them, turn them into live actions, how you can see sort of like other titles coming up to work alongside Cinderella. But from a producer's point of view, I think what comfort you have from a title like Cinderella is the fact that people will come and see it by virtue of its popularity, which allows you to invest in the show and push the boundaries of it. But the marketing of any pantomime is constantly changing. We're in a world now where the vast majority of marketing done across all brands and all products is digital. And it's about thinking of ways to excite and engage with an audience, particularly a young audience who are very tech savvy, and encouraging them to find out about the production that we're doing. We work with the venues to decide the best way of creating a title treatment. And what's interesting about the title of Cinderella is just the fact that it's a lot of letters. And when you write Cinderella and when you work out how you're going to use the title treatment on mobile phones, on billboards, in print, in brochure, on screen, it's about how best to write that title out. A lot of other pantomimes like Dick Whittington or Jack and the Beanstalk have multiple words and you can space them nicely. But Cinderella is a very long title. And I remember when we used to have the sort of like smaller leaflet, which was potentially tall and narrow, trying to fit the title on in a prominent way was always a challenge. So it's things like that. And also when you say Cinderella, it conjures up images. And as panto producers, I think, we have a duty to make sure that we're communicating to our audience what Cinderella is going to be. And if it's a pantomime, it obviously is spectacular and it's magical. And I think we try and reflect that in a title treatment, as opposed to the Rodgers and Hammerstein version or the Andrew Lloyd Webber version, which is clearly a different telling of the story and perhaps doesn't represent pantomime. Our artwork, our marketing is always trying to draw to the fact that this is a pantomime. And we have generations in this country. We're a very diverse society who maybe haven't been to the theatre, who don't know what British pantomime is. And it's about communicating that message as succinctly and as effectively as possible.
That's really interesting, Steve, because a lot of people will have thought, even now, that publicity and marketing is all about putting an advert on a billboard or in a newspaper and so on. And that's, to a certain extent, been left behind now because of social media and so on, isn't it?
It really has. We're a very digital society. Digital is used a lot, and digital actually creates great opportunities for marketing, particularly pantomime. And with the development of our kind of screen-based pantos, where you're surrounded by a world that's moving, evolving, transitioning around you, that provides us with great assets that we can transfer to the marketing campaign. So a lot of what excites me and the team here is how we move forward and how we bring a very, pantomime feel and a pantomime energy to the marketing work that's going on a digital platform and also in print. I think, the audiences that come to pantomime, we must remember, often don't go to the theatre in the rest of the year. And part of our job is to excite them to come to the theatre in the first place and enjoy what we do, and hopefully to encourage them to come back. And I think marketing, when you're marketing the pantomime, I always think you're marketing the premise of getting people to come into a theatre. And that's as important as the title itself.
With that in mind, Eric, of course, the photo shoots and so on before the panto have changed dramatically. They're no longer about, just posing in certain shots for photographs, for billboards or for whatever now. They will include short videos, many of them for TikTok and other reels and so on. And that's a dramatic change from a decade ago even, isn't it?
Oh, totally. Exactly. They've become something just much more accessible to the younger audiences of today and all the social media platforms. We've got to get our stuff out there because it is such a huge marketing tool. And also, bizarrely, as Steve touched on earlier, so many of our venues have digital advertising boards, both inside and outside their buildings, so that we are recording little clips that can actually be where a poster used to be pasted on the wall. It's now a digital board with us in character, inviting people in or giggling or smiling or pointing at people. So it's become a whole different way of achieving the same purpose, is engaging with people, making people look at the poster or the digital version of that poster and saying, look, this is on, come on in, you're going to love it. And as Steve said, our recently rolled out digital versions of Cinderella and more recently Beauty and the Beast carry that almost into the auditorium, where we don't have what people would regard in some of our productions as a traditional set, but we are using this wonderful new technology, digital technology, to animate behind what will always be and what should always be traditional panto values, the routines, the comedy, the music, the magic. But we've just taken it a step forward, and that can be used both on stage and in the marketing of the show in the first place.
Well, at the end of every episode on this occasional series looking at pantomime titles, we're going to finish by looking at the future for that particular title, because for certain pantomime titles, there are challenges that lie ahead because of the way that society and society's views is changing. However, with Cinderella, I think it has a safe future. But Eric, will it still continue in the same form, or will it continue to evolve?
I think will be a certain amount of evolution, and that's probably right, because we have to continue engaging with the ever-changing world round about us. But that traditional fairy tale element, I think, must never be lost. It is magic. Good storytelling is at the heart of all our products, and Cinderella is really a peak example of that. So we mustn't try and be too clever with the tale itself. How it is presented can evolve, can change. We've already mentioned about the ugly sisters becoming wicked stepsisters when portrayed by female presenting performers, and that's something that's certainly worth advancing, exploring further. There are options. Obviously, we have the evolution existing already of the portrayal of Dandini and Prince Charming being traditionally presented by female presenting performers. Now they almost more commonly, although certainly not exclusively, portrayed by male presenting performers. So yes, there is evolution, and there should be. But you know what? We're only doing Cinderella because it's a fantastic story to begin with. It's a story that people love, and that in itself, at the heart of the productions, mustn't change, I believe.
Is it fair to say, Steve, that if the elements of pantomime are there, this is one of the most flexible titles, whether it be a drag pantomime, whether it be, different casting views on it. As long as the elements are there, it will always be successful.
Yes, I think it is. It's a universal story that we can all access, and I think everybody can relate to elements within that story. No matter where you feel your position is in life, however you fit in, there is a part of Cinderella as a tale that you will relate to. And I think that's what makes it so accessible and such a great story for pantomime.
And lots of the other elements, maybe some of the traditional gags will still be around, Eric. I couldn't get my foot into the crystal slipper.
Or you couldn't get your foot into the Crystal Palace. It's
There
got to
it
be
is.
there. It's got to be there. It wouldn't be. No, I think with each year, there's a dwindling number of people who actually understand the gag, but it wouldn't be the same if it wasn't there. And that's panto, and it's those cheesy, corny moments that people are sitting expecting. And I think at the heart of our traditional panto presentation, there is a story of hope. And if that isn't recognizable by everyone from age 3 to 93, then I don't know what is. It's a hope for better times. It's a hope for better relationships. And it's just so accessible and recognizable.
And I think everybody has a dream. And again, that underpins Cinderella. We all dream of what might be. And, very clearly throughout the arc of Cinderella, Cinderella dreams of a better life. The prince dreams of meeting somebody. The ugly sisters dream of meeting somebody. Buttons also has a relationship that he dreams that he could spend time with Cinderella. Everybody has a dream, and the arc of the story is about how those dreams play out.
Finally, Steve, of course, the audience expects, and there are certain things that the audience want to see, and particularly with Cinderella, and we talked about some of them already, but even simple things like the clock striking midnight, Cinderella running from the ball, losing her slipper. Those are the sort of things that kids really get excited about, don't they?
You cannot underestimate the importance of the story arc. And we always say everything in our pantomimes has to hang in balance. There has to be a balance of spectacle, of story, of drama, of jeopardy, of comedy. All those elements can and must work together to produce a really strong panto. The kids want to follow the story. They care about the characters. They care about what happens to Cinderella when she has to run from the ball. Technology now helps us tell these stories in a way that perhaps traditionally hasn't been done. We got very excited about the opportunity to tell the tale from Cinderella's perspective at the point at which she leaves the ball, and rather than her just running out and us not seeing her again until the following morning back in the kitchen, in the digital panto that we rolled out, we wanted to explore that journey, the panic of her leaving the palace, what happens when she climbs back into the carriage and the carriage starts its journey back to Hardup Hall, and the point at which it clearly runs out of magic because the magic is fading, and she ends up sat in the middle of the woods in a pumpkin trying to understand what had happened, absolutely in awe of the evenings she's had and the fact that she's now back in her rags in a pumpkin. The great opportunities that technology provides to tell certain angles of these stories that we maybe haven't explored is immense. And I think for Cinderella, those opportunities will continue to come through.
We've all had nights like that, haven't we? We're going to look at some more of the popular titles in the coming weeks and months. But in the meantime, Steve and Eric, thank you so much for talking to me.
Thanks, Martin.
It's a real pleasure, Martin.
That's about it for now. But as I said at the very beginning of the episode, there are many more fabulous guests still to come. So please make sure you subscribe through your favourite podcast app and join me, Martin Ballard, next time for episode 48, when we'll take a look at the pantomime season from the venue manager's point of view. I'll see you then.
Thank you for listening to the latest edition of Just Imagine, the podcast series from Imagine Theatre. And you can find out more by going to www.imaginetheatre.co.uk.